would you do if your father gave you away to a Viking warrior to pay a debt? Solveig never imagined her life would take such a turn. But when her fate is sealed by a forced marriage, what unfolds is nothing like she expected. Stay with me as we dive into a story of honor, resilience, and an unexpected protector. Thank you so much for watching and for all your comments. Let me know at the end if you liked the story and where you're watching from and why you're following this. The wind howled across the fjord like the breath of ancient gods, carrying with it the scent of salt and pine from the distant forests that crowned the rocky shores. The year was 1873, and the settlement of Kaupang thrived on the southern coast of what would one day be called Norway. It was a trading hub where merchants from distant lands brought amber, furs, and silver, where ships with dragon-headed prows cut through the icy waters, and where the fate of men and women alike could change with a single decision made in the great hall of a jarl. Solveig, Harald's daughter, stood at the edge of the wooden pier, her honey-colored hair whipping around her face as she gazed out at the approaching longship. The vessel moved with purpose through the choppy waters, its sail emblazoned with the mark of Jarl Orm the Red, a man whose reputation preceded him like thunder before a storm. Her heart hammered against her ribs, and she pulled her woolen cloak tighter around her slender frame, though the cold that gripped her had little to do with the autumn air. She was 20 summers old, with eyes the color of the summer sky and features that had drawn the attention of many young men in the settlement. Her father, Harald Magnusson, had always been protective of her, perhaps too protective, but she understood why. After her mother died bringing her younger brother into the world, a brother who had lived only 3 days, her father had poured all his love and fear into keeping her safe. Yet safety, she had learned in recent weeks, was a luxury that could be bartered away when debts grew too heavy to bear. Behind her, the sounds of the settlement carried on the wind. Blacksmiths hammered at their forges, children shouted as they played among the wooden houses with their turf roofs, and women called to one another as they prepared the evening meal. Life continued as it always had, indifferent to the turmoil that churned in Solveig's chest. She thought of the conversation she had overheard 3 nights ago, when her father believed her asleep in the small chamber they shared in their modest home. Harald had borrowed heavily from Jarl Orm to finance a trading expedition that had ended in disaster when storms destroyed 2 of his 3 ships. The debt was crushing, and Orm was not known for his patience or mercy. The Jarl had given Harald an ultimatum: repay the debt in full, an impossible task, or offer something of equal value. That something, Solveig had realized with growing horror as she listened through the wooden partition, was her. Not as a slave, her father had argued desperately with Orm's messenger, but as a bride to one of the Jarl's warriors, a marriage alliance that would settle the debt and perhaps even improve Harald's standing if the match proved favorable. The messenger had laughed, a sound devoid of warmth, and said that Jarl Orm would choose the warrior himself, and that Harald should be grateful the Jarl was offering this option at all, rather than simply taking everything Harald owned, including his daughter. Now, as the longship drew closer, Solveig could make out the figures of men moving about the deck. Her father stood beside her, his weathered face drawn with worry and shame. He had tried to explain, to apologize, but words seemed inadequate in the face of what was about to happen. Harald was a proud man who had been broken by circumstances beyond his control, and Solveig could see the defeat in his eyes even as he tried to stand tall. "Solveig," he began, his voice rough with emotion, "I would give anything for this not to be necessary. You must know that." She turned to look at him, this man who had raised her, taught her to read the runes, to navigate by the stars, to understand the value of honor and family. His hair, once dark as a raven's wing, was now streaked with silver, and new lines creased his face. He looked older than his 45 winters, aged by grief and worry. "I know, father," she replied quietly. Her voice was steady, though her hands trembled slightly beneath her cloak. "You did what you thought you must to survive. I understand survival. Jarl Orm promised the man would be a strong warrior, someone who could provide for you and protect you," Harald continued, as if trying to convince himself as much as her. "He said you would want for nothing." Solveig wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it, but she held her tongue. What good were promises from a man like Orm? What did it matter if her husband was strong if he was also cruel? But she said none of this. Instead, she placed her hand on her father's arm and squeezed gently. "Whatever comes, "I will face it," she said. "We are of the north. We endure." The longship was docking now, and men were throwing ropes to secure it to the pier. Solveig's breath caught as she watched the warriors disembark. They were an imposing lot, these men who served Jarl Orm, with their scarred faces and weapons that had tasted blood in raids across the seas. They moved with the confidence of those who knew their worth in battle, and their eyes swept over the gathered crowd with barely concealed contempt. Then he emerged from the ship, and Solveig felt her heart skip a beat for an entirely different reason. He was tall, taller than any man she had ever seen, with shoulders so broad they seemed to block out the sun. His hair was the color of dark amber, pulled back from his face and bound with leather cord, revealing sharp features that might have been carved from the very cliffs that surrounded the fjord. His jaw was strong and clean-shaven in the way of some warriors who preferred not to hide their faces, and his eyes, when they swept over the crowd and briefly met hers, were the pale gray of winter ice. He wore a tunic of deep blue wool over leather armor, and at his side hung a sword in a scabbard decorated with intricate metalwork. His arms were thick with muscle, the kind that came from years of wielding weapons and rowing across vast distances. There was a wildness about him, something untamed that reminded Solveig of the wolves that sometimes came down from the mountains when winter was harsh. But it was not his size or his obvious strength that made Solveig stare. It was the way he moved, with a fluid grace that seemed at odds with his massive frame, and the way his eyes, despite their coldness, held something she could not quite name. Intelligence, perhaps, or wariness. He looked like a man who had seen much and trusted little. Jarl Orm descended from the ship behind him, a barrel-chested man with a red beard that lived up to his name, and a belly that spoke of many feasts and much mead. He had small, cunning eyes that missed nothing, and when he spotted Harold, a smile spread across his face that did not reach those eyes. "Harold Magnusson!" Orm called out, his voice carrying easily over the noise of the settlement. "I trust you have prepared to honor our agreement." Harold bowed, a gesture that must have cost him dearly in pride. "I have, Jarl Orm. My daughter is here, as promised." Orm's gaze shifted to Solveig, and she felt his eyes rake over her in a way that made her skin crawl. She lifted her chin and met his gaze steadily, refusing to show fear or shame. After a moment, Orm grunted in what might have been approval. "She is fair enough, I suppose," he said dismissively. "Though beauty fades, let us hope she is strong enough to bear sons for my warrior." The tall warrior who had caught Solveig's attention had been standing silently behind Orm, but now he stepped forward. Up close, he was even more imposing, and Solveig had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. Those pale gray eyes studied her with an intensity that made her breath catch, and she had the sudden, dizzying sensation that he was seeing far more than her face and form, that he was somehow looking into her very soul. "This is Leif Svensson," Orm announced, clapping the warrior on the shoulder with a familiarity that the younger man did not seem to return. "One of my finest fighters. He has distinguished himself in battle from the coasts of Ireland to the rivers of the east. He will make you a formidable husband, girl." Leif said nothing, but his eyes never left Solveig's face. She searched his expression for some clue as to what he was thinking, what he felt about this arrangement, but his features might have been carved from stone for all the emotion they revealed. Still, there was something in his gaze, a flicker of something that might have been curiosity or perhaps concern, that gave her a small measure of hope that he was not entirely without feeling. "My daughter, Solveig," Harold said, his voice tight. "She is skilled in weaving and cooking, knows her letters and numbers, and has a good head for managing a household. She will serve you well." Solveig felt a flash of anger at being described like a piece of property, but she swallowed it down. This was not the time for pride or defiance. She needed to survive this, to find a way to make the best of an impossible situation. Leif finally spoke, and his voice was deep, resonant, like distant thunder rolling across the mountains. "Does the woman have a tongue, or does her father speak for her always?" The question was directed at Harold, but Leif's eyes remained on Solveig, and she saw a challenge in them, or perhaps a test. Harold opened his mouth to respond, but Solveig spoke first, her voice clear and steady. "I have a tongue," she said, "and I know how to use it when the occasion demands." A ghost of something that might have been amusement flickered across Leif's features, gone so quickly she might have imagined it. Orm, however, laughed loudly, slapping his thigh. "She has spirit," he declared. "Good. Leif needs a woman who will not wilt at the first hardship. The gods know he is not an easy man to live with." Leif's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but he said nothing. Instead, he turned to Orm and spoke in a low voice that Solveig had to strain to hear. "When is the ceremony to take place?" "Tonight," Orm replied. "No sense in delaying. We sail in 3 days for the autumn raids, and I want this matter settled before we depart. You will remain here with your new bride while we are gone, to guard my interests in Kaupang and ensure the settlement's defenses are maintained." Solveig's mind reeled. Tonight. She was to be married tonight to this stranger, this warrior who looked at her with those cold gray eyes and said so little. She glanced at her father and saw her own shock reflected in his face, but neither of them protested. What would be the point? This was the agreement, and to refuse now would mean ruin, perhaps even death. The rest of the day passed in a blur of preparation. The women of the settlement, some sympathetic and others merely curious, helped Solveig prepare for the ceremony. They dressed her in a gown of deep green wool that had belonged to her mother, fastened with bronze brooches that caught the light of the setting sun. They braided her hair and wove flowers into it, speaking in hushed tones about what she might expect from her wedding night, offering advice that ranged from practical to absurd. Through it all, Solveig felt as if she were watching herself from a distance, as if this were happening to someone else. Her hands moved automatically, fastening clasps and smoothing fabric, while her mind raced with questions and fears. What kind of man was Leif Svensson? Would he be kind, or would he see her merely as payment for her father's debt? Would he expect her to be a dutiful, silent wife, or would he allow her some measure of autonomy? As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Solveig was led to the small temple where the ceremony would take place. It was a simple structure of wood and stone, decorated with carvings of the gods and hung with the shields of warriors who had sworn oaths there. The air inside smelled of smoke and pine, and a fire burned in the central hearth, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Leif was already there, standing beside Orm and the Gothi, the priest who would perform the ceremony. He had changed into a fresh tunic of dark red, and his sword hung at his side, as was traditional for a warrior groom. When Solveig entered, his eyes found hers immediately, and for a moment, the world seemed to narrow to just the two of them. The ceremony was brief, almost perfunctory. Words were spoken, oaths were sworn, and rings were exchanged. Solveig's voice trembled only slightly as she repeated the vows, binding herself to this man for life. Leif's voice was steady and strong, and when he placed the ring on her finger, his hands, so large and calloused from years of wielding weapons, were surprisingly gentle. When it was done, when they were declared husband and wife, Orm called for a feast in celebration. The settlement's great hall was filled with warriors and villagers alike, and mead flowed freely as platters of roasted meat and bread were passed around. Solveig sat beside Leif at the high table, acutely aware of his presence, of the way his arm occasionally brushed against hers, sending jolts of awareness through her body. He spoke little during the feast, responding to toasts and questions from the other warriors with brief, measured words. But she noticed that his eyes often drifted to her, studying her profile when he thought she was not looking. Once, when a drunk warrior made a crude jest about the wedding night, Leif's hand tightened around his drinking horn until she thought it might shatter, and he fixed the man with a stare so cold that the warrior fell silent immediately and found somewhere else to sit. As the night wore on and the mead continued to flow, Solveig found her nervousness growing. Soon, she knew, they would be expected to retire to the small house that had been prepared for them, and then she would truly be alone with this stranger who was now her husband. The thought filled her with a mixture of fear and something else, something she was not quite ready to examine. When Orm finally stood and declared it time for the bride and groom to retire, the hall erupted in cheers and ribald shouts. Leif rose without a word and extended his hand to Solveig. She took it, feeling the strength in his grip, and allowed him to lead her from the hall into the cool night air. The house that had been prepared was small but well built, with a central hearth that had already been lit, filling the single room with warmth and flickering light. A bed piled with furs occupied one corner, and there were a few simple furnishings: a table, stools, chests for storing belongings. It was more than Solveig had expected, and despite everything, She felt a small measure of relief that at least they would have privacy and comfort. Leif closed the door behind them, shutting out the sounds of the feast that continued in the hall. For a long moment, they stood in silence, the air between them thick with tension and unspoken questions. Solveig's heart hammered in her chest, and she clasped her hands together to keep them from shaking. Finally, Leif spoke, his voice quiet and controlled. "You are afraid of me." It was not a question, and Solveig saw no point in denying it. "I am afraid of the unknown," she replied carefully. "Of what you might expect of me, of what my life will be now." He studied her for a long moment, and in the firelight, his features seemed less harsh, almost thoughtful. "I did not ask for this marriage any more than you did," he said at last. "Orm decided that it was time I took a wife, and he chose you as payment for your father's debt. I had no say in the matter." Solveig felt a strange mixture of relief and disappointment at his words. Relief that he was not cruel or dismissive, but disappointment that he seemed to view their marriage as merely another duty imposed upon him by his jarl. "Then we are both prisoners of circumstance," she said softly. "Perhaps," Leif agreed. He moved to the table and poured water from a pitcher into 2 cups, handing one to her. "But we need not be enemies. You are my wife now, and I will honor that bond. I will protect you and provide for you. That is my oath to you, Solveig, Harald's daughter." Solveig took the cup he offered, their fingers brushing briefly in the exchange. The touch sent an unexpected warmth through her, and she quickly raised the cup to her lips to hide her confusion. The water was cool and clean, helping to settle her racing thoughts. She watched as Leif moved to sit on one of the stools, his large frame making the simple furniture seem almost delicate. He gestured for her to sit as well, and she chose the stool across from him, maintaining a careful distance. "I know what the others expect of tonight," Leif said, his gray eyes meeting hers directly. "But I will not force myself upon you. You have had enough forced upon you already." He paused, seeming to choose his next words carefully. "When we share a bed, it will be because you wish it, not because you feel obligated." Solveig felt tears prick at her eyes, though she blinked them back fiercely. She had steeled herself for the worst, had prepared herself to endure whatever this night might bring, and his unexpected kindness threatened to undo her carefully maintained composure. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why would you show me such consideration when you owe me nothing?" Leif was silent for a long moment, staring into the flames of the hearth. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight of old pain. "Because I know what it is to be powerless, to have your fate decided by others who care nothing for your wishes or your pain. I swore to myself long ago that if I ever had power over another's life, I would not abuse it as others have abused theirs over me." There was a story there, Solveig realized, hidden in the shadows of his words. She wanted to ask, to understand this complicated man who was now her husband, but she sensed that now was not the time. Instead, she nodded slowly. "Thank you," she said simply, "for giving me a choice. It is more than I expected." "You should rest," Leif said, rising from his stool. "Tomorrow will bring new challenges as you adjust to your life here. I will sleep by the fire tonight. The bed is yours." Solveig wanted to protest, to say that she could not take the only bed while he slept on the hard floor, but she could see from the set of his jaw that his mind was made up. She stood as well, smoothing down her dress. "Leif," she said, and he turned to look at her. "Perhaps we could share the bed. It is large enough, and you have shown yourself to be a man of honor. I trust your word." Something flickered in his eyes, surprise perhaps, or respect. After a moment, he nodded. "As you wish." They prepared for sleep in awkward silence, each acutely aware of the other's presence. Solveig removed her brooches and outer dress, folding it carefully and placing it in one of the chests. Beneath, she wore a simple linen shift that fell to her ankles. She could feel Leif's eyes on her, though when she glanced his way, he quickly looked elsewhere. He removed his sword belt and outer tunic, revealing a linen shirt that did little to hide the powerful muscles of his chest and arms. Scars crossed his skin, some old and faded, others more recent, testament to the battles he had fought. They climbed into the bed from opposite sides, maintaining a careful distance between them. The furs were soft and warm, and despite her nervousness, Solveig felt exhaustion beginning to claim her. The events of the day had drained her more than she had realized, and the warmth of the bed was almost intoxicating after the tension she had been carrying. "Solveig," Leif's voice came through the darkness, low and thoughtful. Tell me about yourself, not what your father told Orm about your skills, but who you truly are. What do you love? What do you fear? The question surprised her, and she turned her head on the pillow to look at his profile in the dim firelight. I love the sea, she said after a moment, the way it changes from moment to moment, the power of it. My father used to take me on his trading voyages when I was younger, before my mother died. I loved standing at the prow of the ship, feeling the spray on my face, watching the horizon stretch out endlessly before us. And what do you fear? Leif asked. Solveig thought carefully before answering. I fear becoming invisible, she said finally. I fear living a life where I matter to no one, where I make no difference. I fear dying without having truly lived. She paused, then added quietly, and I fear that this marriage will be a cage. Beautiful perhaps, but a cage nonetheless. Leif was silent for so long that she thought he might have fallen asleep. But then he spoke. I cannot promise you freedom in the way you might wish it, he said. The world we live in does not offer such things easily to anyone, man or woman. But I can promise you that I will not make you invisible. I will see you, Solveig. I will hear you. And I will do what I can to ensure that your life has meaning and purpose. Why? She asked again, the question that seemed to define this strange night. Why do you care? Because, Leif said, his voice rough with emotion she did not understand. Everyone deserves to be seen. Everyone deserves to matter. Solveig felt something shift inside her, a tiny crack in the wall she had built around her heart. This man, this warrior who could kill without hesitation, who served a jarl known for his ruthlessness, spoke with a gentleness and understanding that she had not expected to find. Tell me about yourself, she said softly. Who is Leif Svensson when he is not swinging a sword for Jarl Orm? She heard him exhale slowly. That is a complicated question, he said. I am not sure I know the answer anymore. I have been a warrior for so long that I have forgotten what else I might be. Then tell me how you became a warrior. Solveig pressed gently. Tell me your story. Leif shifted in the bed, and she could feel the tension in his body even across the space between them. I was born in a small village far to the north, he began, his voice taking on a distant quality, as if he were seeing the past laid out before him. My father, Sven, was a farmer, not a wealthy man, but proud and hard-working. My mother, Helga, was the daughter of a blacksmith. They loved each other deeply, and they loved me and my younger sister, Sigrid. He paused, and Solveig waited, sensing that what came next was painful. When I was 15 winters old, raiders came to our village. Not Vikings from other lands, but men from a neighboring jarl who coveted our lands and resources. They came in the night, burning and killing. My father tried to fight them off, but he was a farmer with a scythe against trained warriors with swords and axes. Solveig's breath caught. What happened? They killed him, Leif said flatly. They killed my mother as well when she tried to protect Sigrid. They took my sister, who was only 12, and they would have killed me too if I had not fought like a madman. I managed to wound 3 of them before they overwhelmed me. Their leader, a man named Haldor the Cruel, found my rage amusing. He said I had the heart of a warrior, and that it would be a waste to kill me. So instead he gave me a choice: swear loyalty to his jarl and train to become a warrior, or watch as they killed my sister slowly before finishing me as well. Oh, Leif, Solveig whispered, her heart aching for the boy he had been, forced to make such an impossible choice. I swore the oath, Leif continued. I became a warrior, and I trained harder than anyone else, driven by the need to become strong enough to protect Sigrid, to one day earn our freedom. But the world is cruel, Solveig. 2 years later, Sigrid fell ill with a fever that swept through the Jarl's settlement. There were no healers skilled enough to save her, and I was away on a raid, unable to be with her when she died. His voice cracked slightly. I failed her. I became a warrior to protect her, and in the end I could not even be there to hold her hand as she left this world. Solveig found herself moving across the bed without conscious thought, drawn by the raw pain in his voice. She reached out and placed her hand on his arm, feeling the tension in his muscles. It was not your fault, she said firmly. You did what you had to do to survive, to give her a chance at life. That you could not control fate does not make you a failure. Leif turned his head to look at her, and in the dim light she could see moisture gleaming in his eyes. I tell myself that, he said, but the guilt remains. After Sigrid died, I had nothing left to fight for except survival itself. I became the perfect warrior, unquestioning and efficient, because feeling nothing was easier than feeling everything. Jarl Orm heard of my skills and recruited me away from Haldor's service 5 years ago. I have served him ever since, fighting his battles, carrying out his orders, existing but not truly living. Until now? Solveig asked softly. Leif's hand came up to cover hers where it rested on his arm. His palm was warm and calloused, but his touch was gentle. Perhaps, he said. When Orm told me I was to take a wife, I felt nothing at first, just another duty to perform. But when I saw you on that pier, standing so proud despite your fear, your hair like gold in the sunlight, and your eyes blazing with defiance even as you accepted your fate, I felt something I had not felt in years. I felt hope. Solveig's breath caught at his words. Hope for what? Hope that perhaps I could be more than just a weapon, Leif said. Hope that perhaps I could build something instead of only destroying. Hope that perhaps with time, we could find something real in this marriage that was forced upon us both. They lay there in the darkness, hands touching, sharing warmth and unspoken understanding. Solveig felt her perception of this man shifting, reshaping itself around these new revelations. He was not the cold, unfeeling warrior she had feared. He was a man who had endured terrible loss and had survived by burying his emotions deep, but who had not lost his capacity for gentleness or his desire for connection. I think, Solveig said slowly, that we might both find what we are looking for, if we are brave enough to try. Leif's fingers tightened around hers. Then we will try, he said. Together. They fell asleep like that, hands joined across the furs, two wounded souls finding unexpected comfort in each other's presence. It was not the wedding night that either the settlement or the warriors in the great hall would have imagined, but it was theirs, honest and real in a way that transcended the circumstances that had brought them together. The morning came with pale light filtering through the gaps in the wooden walls. Solveig woke to find herself closer to Leif than she had been when she fell asleep, her head resting against his shoulder and his arm draped loosely around her waist. For a moment, panic fluttered in her chest, but then she remembered the conversation they had shared, the vulnerability he had shown her, and she relaxed. Leif stirred, his eyes opening slowly. When he realized their position, he immediately began to pull away, but Solveig stopped him with a hand on his chest. "It is all right," she said softly. "I do not mind." He studied her face, searching for signs of discomfort or fear, but finding none, he settled back down. "Good morning, wife," he said, and there was a hint of warmth in his voice that had not been there the day before. "Good morning, husband," Solveig replied, testing the words on her tongue. They felt strange but not unwelcome. They rose and dressed, the awkwardness of the previous evening replaced by a tentative ease. Leif helped her fasten one of her brooches when her fingers fumbled with the clasp, his large hands surprisingly deft. When they emerged from their house, they found the settlement already bustling with activity. Women were drawing water from the well, men were repairing fishing nets, and children were chasing each other between the houses, their laughter ringing out in the crisp morning air. Solveig spotted her father near the edge of the settlement, speaking with one of the other traders. When he saw her, relief flooded his features, and he hurried over. His eyes went from Solveig to Leif and back again, searching for signs of harm or distress. "Solveig," he said, his voice tight with worry. "Are you well?" "I am well, father," she assured him, and she meant it. "Leif has been kind to me." "You need not worry." Harold's shoulders sagged with relief, and he turned to Leif with gratitude shining in his eyes. "Thank you," he said simply. "Thank you for treating her with honor." Leif nodded acknowledgement, but said nothing. Solveig could sense his discomfort with the gratitude, as if he felt he deserved no thanks for simply being decent. She made a mental note to explore that later, to understand why he seemed to think so little of his own capacity for goodness. The next 2 days passed in a blur of activity as the settlement prepared for Jarl Orm's departure on the autumn raids. Ships were loaded with supplies, weapons were sharpened, and warriors made their farewells to wives and families. Solveig spent the time learning her way around the settlement, meeting the other women, and beginning to understand what her role would be as the wife of one of Orm's most respected warriors. Some of the women were welcoming, offering advice and friendship. Others were more reserved, watching her with suspicious eyes, perhaps wondering if she thought herself better than them, because of who her husband was. Solveig did her best to be friendly and humble, remembering that she was the newcomer here and that trust would have to be earned. Leif spent much of his time with the other warriors, preparing for the responsibilities he would have while Orm was away. As the designated protector of Kaupang during the raids, he would be in charge of the settlement's defenses, responsible for organizing patrols and ensuring that no rival jarls took advantage of Orm's absence to attack. It was a position of great trust, and Solveig began to understand just how highly Orm valued Leif's loyalty and skills. On the evening before the departure, Orm called a feast in the great hall to honor those who would be sailing with him and those who would be staying behind to guard what was his. The hall was packed with bodies, the air thick with smoke and the smell of roasted meat. Mead flowed freely, and the warriors grew loud and boisterous, their voices raised in songs of past glories and future victories. Solveig sat beside Leif at the high table once again, but this time, the atmosphere between them was different. They spoke quietly to each other during lulls in the noise, sharing observations about the people around them, finding humor in small things. Leif even smiled once or twice, transforming his harsh features into something almost beautiful, and Solveig found herself wanting to make him smile more often. "You seem different tonight," she observed, leaning close so he could hear her over the din. Less guarded, Leif glanced at her, and in his eyes, she saw a softness that made her heart skip. "Perhaps I am learning that not all cages are prisons," he said quietly. "Perhaps some bonds are chosen, even if they begin as obligation." Before Solveig could respond, Orm stood and called for silence, his booming voice cutting through the noise like an axe through wood. The hall quieted, all eyes turning to the Jarl. "Tomorrow we sail," Orm announced, raising his drinking horn high. "We sail to claim glory and riches, to remind the world that the North remembers how to take what it wants. But we leave behind those who will guard what is ours, and chief among them is Leif Svensson, who will hold Kaupang in my stead." The warriors cheered, banging their fists on the tables in approval. Leif stood and raised his own horn in acknowledgement, his face impassive once more, the warrior's mask back in place. "I will guard Kaupang with my life," Leif declared, his voice carrying to every corner of the hall. "No harm will come to what is yours, Jarl Orm. This I swear." Orm grinned, clearly pleased. "I know you will, Leif. You have never failed me, and I trust you will not start now." He paused, then added with a sly look, "And perhaps by the time I return, your new bride will have given you a son to train in the ways of the warrior." The hall erupted in raucous laughter and cheers, and Solveig felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment. She kept her eyes down, focusing on her hands clasped in her lap, trying to ignore the crude jests that followed Orm's comment. She felt Leif sit back down beside her, and his hand found hers under the table, squeezing gently in silent support. The morning of the departure dawned gray and cold, with fog rolling in from the fjord and wrapping the settlement in a shroud of mist. Solveig stood beside Leif on the pier, watching as the warriors loaded the last of their supplies onto the longships. The dragon-headed prows seemed to emerge from the fog like creatures from the old stories, ready to carry their crews across the whale road to distant lands. Jarl Orm was in high spirits, striding about the dock and shouting orders, his red beard seeming to glow even in the pale morning light. The warriors responded with efficiency born of long practice, their movements coordinated and swift. These were men who had raided together many times before, who knew their places and their roles without needing to be told. Solveig felt Leif's tension beside her, though his face remained impassive. His hand rested on the pommel of his sword, and his eyes tracked every movement, every warrior, every detail of the preparations. She had come to recognize this stance in the days since their marriage. It was the posture of a man who trusted nothing and no one completely, who was always ready for danger, even in moments of apparent peace. "You wish you were going with them," she said quietly, not a question but a statement. Leif glanced down at her, surprise flickering across his features before he controlled it. "What makes you say that?" "The way you watch them," Solveig replied. "The way your hand tightens on your sword when they speak of the glory they will win. You are a warrior, Leif. Battle is what you know, what you have built your life around. It must be difficult to stay behind while others seek honor and treasure." He was silent for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was thoughtful. "You see much, wife." "Yes, part of me wishes to be aboard those ships. The simplicity of battle, the clarity of it, has always been easier for me than the complexities of life in the settlement. In battle, you know who your enemies are. You know what is expected of you. Kill or be killed, win or lose. There is no ambiguity. And here? Solveig asked. Here, everything is ambiguous, Leif said. Here, I must navigate relationships and responsibilities that have no clear path to victory. Here, I must be more than just a weapon. He paused, then added softly, but here is also where you are, and I find that matters more to me with each passing day. Solveig felt warmth bloom in her chest at his words. In the days since their wedding, they had grown closer, sharing meals and conversations, learning the small details of each other's lives. They still had not consummated their marriage, and Leif had not pressed the issue, but the distance between them in their bed had grown smaller each night. Sometimes she woke to find herself curled against his side, or his arm around her shoulders, and neither of them moved away anymore. Orm's voice boomed across the dock, calling for life. Svensson! A word before we depart. Leif squeezed Solveig's hand briefly before striding toward the Jarl. She watched as the two men spoke, their heads bent close together. Orm was gesturing emphatically, and though she could not hear their words, she could see the seriousness in both their expressions. After several minutes, Leif nodded and clasped Orm's forearm in the warrior's grip, and the Jarl clapped him on the shoulder before turning to board his ship. Leif returned to Solveig's side as the longships began to push away from the dock, their oars cutting through the water in perfect rhythm. The warriors called out farewells to those remaining behind, their voices carrying across the fog-shrouded water. Solveig watched until the ships disappeared into the mist, swallowed by the gray as completely as if they had never been. What did Orm say to you? She asked as they walked back toward the settlement. He reminded me of my responsibilities, Leif replied. He expects the settlement to be as he left it when he returns, prosperous and secure. He also warned me that there are men among those remaining who may test my authority, who see my appointment as guardian of Kaupang as an insult to their own standing. Solveig frowned. Who would challenge you? Everyone speaks of your prowess in battle. Prowess in battle is not the same as skill in leadership, Leif said. And there are those who resent that Orm chose me, a man who came from outside his original crew, over warriors who have served him longer. Chief among them is Canute Ironhand, who captains one of the merchant vessels that remain in port. He has made no secret of his belief that he should have been left in charge. Is he dangerous? Solveig asked, concern threading through her voice. Potentially, Leif admitted. Canute is ambitious and clever, and he commands the loyalty of several other men. I will need to watch him carefully, to ensure that his ambition does not lead him to do something foolish that could endanger the settlement. Over the following days, Solveig saw firsthand what Leif had meant. As the guardian of Kaupang in Orm's absence, Leif took his responsibilities seriously. He organized patrols of the surrounding area, established watches to guard against raiders, and ensured that the settlement's defenses were maintained. He settled disputes between the inhabitants, mediated disagreements over trade goods and territory, and listened to the concerns of those who sought his counsel. It was exhausting work, and Solveig could see the toll it took on him. Each evening he returned to their home with weariness etched into every line of his face, the weight of responsibility heavy on his broad shoulders. But he never complained, never shirked his duties, and slowly, grudgingly, even those who had initially resented his appointment began to show him respect. Solveig did her part as well, establishing herself among the women of the settlement. She helped with the harvest that was being brought in from the surrounding fields, worked the looms alongside the other wives, and proved herself capable and willing to contribute. She also made it a point to be gracious and kind, remembering names and showing genuine interest in the lives of those around her. But she also kept her ears open, listening to the gossip and whispers that flowed through the settlement like water. It was through this network of women's talk that she first learned of the growing discontent among Canute Ironhand's followers. They say that Leif is too severe. One of the older women, Inga, confided to Solveig one afternoon as they worked side by side, carding wool, that he enforces Orm's laws too strictly, that he shows no flexibility or understanding of how things have always been done. What sort of laws? Solveig asked carefully, keeping her tone neutral. Inga glanced around to ensure they would not be overheard before continuing in a lower voice. There has always been some flexibility in how traders conduct their business. some understanding that not every transaction need be reported to the Jarl for his share. It is how men like Knut have prospered, by keeping some portion of their profits for themselves. But Leif insists that every trade be recorded, every transaction accounted for. He says he will not allow Orm to return and find that he has been cheated. Solveig considered this carefully. But surely Orm would be angrier if he discovered that his men had been stealing from him while he was away. Leif is protecting Knut and the others from their own greed. Perhaps, Inga said doubtfully, but men do not always see it that way. They see only what they are losing, not what they are being saved from. That evening, Solveig shared what she had learned with Leif. They were in their home, sitting at the small table and sharing a simple meal of bread, cheese, and dried fish. Leif listened intently as she relayed Inga's words, his expression growing darker with each sentence. "I knew Knut was unhappy with my enforcement of Orm's laws," he said when she finished, "but I did not realize the discontent had spread so far. This is troubling, Solveig. If Knut convinces enough men to support him, he could create real problems. What will you do?" she asked. Leif was silent for a moment, his fingers drumming against the wooden table. "I will confront him," he said finally. "Tomorrow I will call a gathering of all the men who remain in Kaupang and address this directly. If Knut has grievances, let him voice them openly where all can hear, rather than poisoning minds with whispers in the shadows. Is that wise?" Solveig asked, worry knotting in her stomach. "If you challenge him publicly, he may feel forced to respond with violence to save his honor." "Perhaps," Leif acknowledged. "But the alternative is to allow this discontent to fester until it explodes at a moment of his choosing rather than mine. Better to force the confrontation now, when I am prepared for it." Solveig reached across the table and took his hand in hers. "Then I will stand with you," she said firmly. "Whatever comes." Leif's eyes softened as he looked at her, and he raised her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "You are braver than you know, Solveig. I am fortunate to have you as my wife, and I am fortunate to have a husband who values justice over popularity," she replied, "even if it makes life more difficult." That night, as they lay in their bed, Solveig found herself unable to sleep. She listened to the sound of Leif's breathing beside her, steady and deep, and marveled at how much had changed in such a short time. This man who had been a stranger, who she had feared would be cruel or indifferent, had become someone she cared for deeply, someone she was beginning to love. The realization should have frightened her, but instead, it filled her with a quiet certainty. Whatever challenges tomorrow brought, they would face them together. The gathering was held in the Great Hall at midday, when the settlement's men could be assembled without disrupting the essential work that kept them all fed and sheltered. Solveig stood at the back of the hall with the other women, though Leif had offered to have her sit beside him at the high table. She had declined, sensing that her presence there might be seen as inappropriate or presumptuous by men who were already looking for reasons to question Leif's authority. Leif stood before the assembled men, his tall frame commanding attention even in silence. He had dressed with care that morning, wearing his finest tunic and his sword at his side, every inch the warrior and leader. When he spoke, his voice carried clearly to every corner of the hall. "I have called you here because it has come to my attention that there is discontent among some of you regarding how I have carried out Jarl Orm's instructions during his absence," Leif began. "Rather than allow whispers and resentment to divide us, I thought it better to speak openly and honestly about these grievances. If any man has issue with my leadership, let him voice it now, and we will address it together." For a moment there was silence. The men shifted uncomfortably, glancing at one another, waiting to see who would speak first. Then Knut Ironhand rose from where he sat near the front of the hall. Knut was a large man, though not as tall as Leif, with a thick black beard and arms like tree trunks from years of hauling cargo and manning oars. His eyes were small and dark, glittering with cunning and poorly concealed anger. "I will speak," he said, his voice carrying an edge of challenge, "since Leif Svensson seems so eager to hear our complaints." "Speak then, Knut," Leif said calmly. "Tell me what troubles you." "What troubles me," Knut said, "is that you enforce Orm's laws as if we were slaves rather than free men. You demand accounting of every trade, every transaction, taking away the small freedoms that have always been part of a merchant's life. You patrol the settlement like we are prisoners who might escape at any moment. You show no trust, no understanding of how things work here. Murmurs of agreement rippled through some of the gathered men, though others remained silent, watching to see how Leif would respond. "I enforce Orm's laws because that is what he commanded me to do," Leif replied, his voice still calm but carrying an undertone of steel. "When he placed Kaupang in my care, he made clear what he expected, that the settlement would be secure, prosperous, and honest. I cannot ensure honesty if I turn a blind eye to men who cheat their jarl out of his rightful share. I cannot ensure prosperity if I allow laziness and corruption to take root. And I cannot ensure security if I do not know what is happening in every corner of the territory I am sworn to protect." "Honesty," Knut scoffed. "Or is it that you seek to make yourself look good in Orm's eyes by being his faithful dog, reporting every minor transgression so that he will reward you while the rest of us suffer?" The insult hung in the air, and Solveig felt her heart begin to race. She could see the anger flash in Leif's eyes, quickly controlled but there nonetheless. Around the hall, men leaned forward, sensing that the confrontation was reaching a critical point. "Choose your next words carefully, Knut," Leif said, his voice dropping to a dangerous quiet. "I have been patient with your disrespect because I understand that change is difficult. But there are limits to my patience, and you are approaching them rapidly." "Or what?" Knut challenged, taking a step forward. "Will you strike me down for speaking truth? Will you prove that you are nothing but Orm's enforcer, caring nothing for the men you are supposed to lead? If you believe I care nothing for the men of this settlement, then you understand nothing," Leif said. "Everything I do, every law I enforce, every patrol I organize, is to protect you and your families. Do you think raiders care whether you have been honest in your business dealings? Do you think rival jarls will spare Kaupang because some of you object to proper accounting? I am trying to keep you alive and prosperous, Knut, even if you are too short-sighted to see it." "Pretty words," Knut sneered, "but I say you are a tyrant hiding behind Orm's authority, and I say that many here agree with me, even if they lack the courage to speak it aloud." Leif's jaw tightened, but when he spoke again, his voice was measured and controlled. "Then let us settle this in the way of our people. You claim I am unfit to lead. I say I am doing exactly what Orm commanded. Let the men decide. Those who support my leadership stand on my right. Those who support Knut's accusations stand on his left. Let us see where the truth lies." The hall erupted in noise as men began to move, some immediately going to stand with Leif, others hesitating, looking between the two men uncertainly. Solveig watched with her heart in her throat as the settlement's men divided themselves, each choice carrying weight and consequence. When the movement finally stilled, the result was clear. The majority of the men stood with Leif, perhaps 2/3 of those assembled. On Knut's side stood maybe 15 or 20 men, enough to cause trouble but far from a majority. Knut's face darkened with fury as he surveyed the result, his fists clenching at his sides. "It seems the men have spoken, Knut," Leif said quietly. Knut's face twisted with rage, his pride clearly wounded by the public rebuke. For a tense moment, Solveig thought he might draw his weapon and attack Leif right there in the hall. His hand moved toward the axe at his belt, and the men around him tensed, ready for violence. But Leif did not flinch, did not reach for his own sword. He simply stood there, tall and unwavering, his gray eyes locked on Knut's face with an intensity that spoke of absolute confidence. "Draw that weapon, Knut Ironhand," Leif said quietly, his voice carrying in the suddenly silent hall. "And you will not live to see the sun set. I have given you the chance to voice your grievances honorably, and the men have judged between us. Accept their decision with grace, or prove yourself the coward and fool I am beginning to suspect you are." The insult was calculated, delivered with such cold precision that it cut deeper than any blade. Knut's hand trembled on his axe, his breath coming in short, angry bursts. But he saw what Solveig saw. The men who had stood with Leif were watching him now, hands near their own weapons, ready to defend the man Orm had chosen to lead them. Even some of those who had stood with Knut looked uncertain, as if realizing that open rebellion against Leif would be rebellion against the Jarl himself. Slowly, with visible effort, Knut released his grip on the axe. "This is not finished," he hissed, his voice thick with barely controlled fury. "You may have won today, Svensson, but a man's fortunes can change quickly in this world. Remember that." "Is that a threat?" Leif asked calmly. "It is a promise," Knut spat. Then he turned and strode from the hall, his supporters following behind him like a pack of whipped dogs. The heavy door slammed shut behind them, the sound echoing through the suddenly quiet space. Leif waited until the sound of their footsteps had faded before turning to address the men who remained. "I know that some of you stood with me today out of loyalty to Orm rather than trust in me," he said, his voice honest and direct. "That is understandable. I am still new to this role, still learning how to balance the demands of leadership with the need for fairness and compassion. But I promise you this. I will always act in the best interests of this settlement and its people. I will always be honest with you, even when the truth is hard to hear. And I will always fight to protect what is ours from those who would take it, whether those enemies come from outside our walls or from within them." One of the older warriors, a grizzled man named Thorstein who had served Orm for many years, stepped forward. "You handled that well, Leif," he said gruffly. "Better than I expected, truth be told. Canute has been a thorn in many men's sides for years, but he has always been careful to stay just on the right side of open rebellion. You forced him to show his hand, and in doing so, you showed us your measure. I, for one, am satisfied with what I saw." Other men voiced their agreement, and slowly, the tension in the hall began to dissipate. Leif thanked them for their support and dismissed the gathering, reminding them to remain vigilant and to report anything suspicious. As the men filed out, returning to their various tasks, Solveig made her way through the crowd to Leif's side. "That was dangerous," she said quietly, keeping her voice low so only he could hear. "You gambled that the men would support you over Canute." "It was a calculated risk," Leif admitted, some of the rigidity leaving his posture now that the immediate crisis had passed. "But one I had to take. Canute was poisoning the well, turning men against me through whispers and insinuations. By forcing him to confront me openly, I gave the men a clear choice. Most chose honor and loyalty over greed and ambition. That tells me that this settlement is stronger than Canute believed. But he will not forget this humiliation," Solveig warned. "Men like Canute do not forgive being made to look foolish in front of others. He will seek revenge, one way or another." "I know," Leif said grimly, "which is why I will be watching him very carefully. And why I need you to keep listening to the women's talk, to warn me if you hear of any plots or plans. Canute may not attack me directly, but he might try more subtle means of undermining my authority." Solveig nodded, understanding the weight of what he was asking. "I will do what I can. But Leif, you must be careful. Do not let your guard down, not even for a moment." He reached out and cupped her face gently in his large hand, his thumb brushing across her cheekbone. "I promise," he said softly. "I have too much to live for now to be careless with my life." The warmth in his eyes made her breath catch, and without thinking, she leaned into his touch. They stood there for a moment, the great hall empty around them, connected by something that had grown from obligation into something far more precious. Then Leif leaned down and pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead, a gesture so tender that it made her heart ache. "Come," he said, taking her hand. "Let us go home. I find I am weary of politics and power struggles. I want only to sit by our fire and talk with my wife about simpler things." The days that followed the confrontation were tense, but quiet. Canute and his supporters kept to themselves, conducting their business with sullen efficiency, but making no overt moves against Leif's authority. The patrols continued, the settlement's defenses were maintained, and life went on much as it had before. But there was an undercurrent of unease, a sense that something was building beneath the surface like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. Solveig found herself falling into a rhythm with Leif that felt increasingly natural and right. They woke together each morning, breaking their fast before he went to attend to his duties and she to hers. In the evenings they would share a meal and talk about their days, about the people they had encountered, the problems they had solved or tried to solve. Leif began to ask her opinion on matters of settlement governance, valuing her insights and observations in a way that surprised and pleased her. Their physical relationship had also evolved, though slowly and with care. They held hands now without thinking about it, and Leif would often pull her close when they sat by the fire, his arm around her shoulders as they talked. At night, they slept entwined, finding comfort in each other's warmth and presence. Kisses had become more frequent, gentle and sweet, conveying affection and growing desire without demanding more than either was ready to give. One evening, about 2 weeks after the confrontation with Canute, Solveig was returning from the well when she overheard voices coming from behind one of the storage houses. She recognized Canute's rough tones immediately, and instinct made her pause and listen rather than continuing on her way. It has to be done soon, Knut was saying, his voice low and urgent, before Orm returns and Leif can poison the Jarl's mind against us. Once Orm hears Leif's version of events, we will have no chance to present our own case. But how? Another voice asked, one Solveig did not recognize. Leif is always surrounded by men loyal to him. We cannot simply attack him openly. The settlement would turn against us completely. Not openly, you fool, Knut hissed. An accident, a tragedy. Leif is organizing a hunting party for 3 days hence, to bring in meat for the winter stores. Accidents happen on hunts. A bow misfires, an arrow goes astray. A man falls from a cliff while tracking a deer. Who can say it was anything but bad luck? Solveig's blood ran cold. They were planning to murder Leif, to make it look like an accident during the hunt. She pressed herself against the wall of the building, her heart pounding so loudly she feared they would hear it. And if suspicion falls on us anyway? The other man asked nervously. Then we deny everything, Knut said confidently. We express our sorrow at the loss of such a fine warrior. We offer to help maintain order until Orm returns, and once the Jarl is back, we explain how Leif had been acting strangely, making enemies, enforcing laws too harshly. Orm will believe us over the word of a dead man. What about the woman? Leif's wife? She seems clever. She might suspect. Knut laughed, a sound devoid of humor. She is just a woman, and a new one to the settlement at that. Who would listen to her accusations? Besides, if she proves troublesome, widows can meet with accidents too. Now gather the others we trust. Make sure they understand their roles. This must be executed perfectly, or we will all hang from Orm's gallows. Solveig waited until she heard their footsteps retreating before she dared to move. Her hands shook as she clutched her water bucket, her mind racing. She had to warn Leif, had to tell him what she had heard. But she also knew that without proof, without witnesses, it would be his word against Knut's, and that could tear the settlement apart. She hurried home, her mind working furiously. When she burst through the door, Leif looked up from where he sat, sharpening his sword, concern immediately crossing his features at the sight of her pale face and trembling hands. Solveig, what is wrong? He asked, setting aside his whetstone and rising to meet her. She set down her bucket and gripped his arms, her words tumbling out in a rush. Leif, I overheard Knut talking with one of his men. They are planning to kill you during the hunt in 3 days. They want to make it look like an accident, an arrow gone astray or a fall. You cannot go on that hunt. You cannot give them the opportunity. Leif's face went hard, his eyes turning cold as winter ice. Tell me everything, he commanded, his voice tight with controlled fury. Solveig relayed every word she had heard, watching as Leif's jaw clenched tighter with each sentence. When she finished, he was silent for a long moment, his mind clearly working through the implications and possibilities. If I do not go on the hunt, he said finally, I will look like a coward, and Knut will simply find another opportunity. But if I do go, I am walking into a trap. He began to pace, his warrior's mind analyzing the tactical situation. I need to turn this trap against him, to force him to reveal his intentions in a way that cannot be denied or explained away. How? Solveig asked, fear clutching at her heart. Leif stopped pacing and looked at her, and she saw the grim determination in his eyes. By going on the hunt as planned, but making sure I have witnesses I trust positioned to see whatever Knut attempts. If he or his men try to kill me and fail, if they are caught in the act by men whose word cannot be questioned, then we will have the proof we need to move against them. But the risk, Solveig protested. Leif, what if something goes wrong? What if the witnesses are not close enough? Or Knut's men are better at deception than we anticipate? I cannot lose you. Not now. Not when I have only just found you. The raw emotion in her voice seemed to shake something loose in Leif. He crossed to her in 2 long strides and pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly against his chest. She could feel the rapid beat of his heart, hear the emotion in his voice when he spoke. I will not leave you, he promised fiercely. I will take every precaution, trust only those I am certain of. Thorstein and his sons, they are loyal. I will make sure they are positioned to watch my back throughout the hunt, and I will be on my guard every moment, expecting treachery at every turn. Solveig pulled back enough to look up into his face, her hands coming up to frame his jaw. Promise me, she demanded. Promise me you will come back to me. Promise me we will have the life together that we are only beginning to build. Instead of answering with words, Leif lowered his head and captured her lips with his. This kiss was different from the gentle ones they had shared before. This was deep and passionate, filled with all the emotion and desire they had been holding back, all the fear and hope and love that had been growing between them. Solveig melted into him, her arms wrapping around his neck, kissing him back with equal fervor. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, Leif rested his forehead against hers. "I promise," he said hoarsely. "I promise to come back to you, to build the life we both deserve. I promise to protect what we have found together with every breath in my body." That night, their relationship changed once more. What had been growing between them for weeks finally blossomed into full intimacy as they came together with tenderness and passion, expressing with their bodies what words could not fully convey. Afterward, as they lay tangled together in their bed, Solveig traced the scars on Leif's chest with gentle fingers. "Tell me about these," she said softly. "Tell me the stories written on your skin." Leif captured her hand and pressed a kiss to her palm. "Each one is a lesson," he said quietly, "a reminder of battles fought and survived. But they are the past, Solveig. You are my future. You and the life we will build together when this business with Knut is settled." "What do you want from that life?" she asked, curious about his dreams and hopes beyond the immediate crisis. Leif was silent for a long moment, his fingers threading through her honey-colored hair. "I want peace," he said finally. "I want to wake beside you every morning and know that the greatest challenge I will face that day is deciding which field to plow or which fence to mend. I want children, if the gods bless us with them, children who will never know the kind of loss and pain I experienced. I want to grow old with you, Solveig, to watch our hair turn gray and our bodies slow, knowing that we built something good and true together." Tears pricked at Solveig's eyes at the simple beauty of his vision. "I want that too," she whispered. "So you must be careful on this hunt. You must outsmart Knut and his treachery, so that we can have the future we both dream of." "I will," Leif promised. "Knut thinks he is clever, but he has made a critical mistake. He has underestimated my wife, and in doing so he has given us the advantage. We know his plan, we can prepare for it, and we will turn his own trap against him." The next 2 days were spent in careful preparation. Leif met secretly with Thorstein and his 2 sons, Eric and Halvard, both skilled warriors in their own right. He explained what Solveig had overheard and what he anticipated Knut might attempt. The 3 men listened grimly, their faces hardening with anger at the betrayal being planned. "We will watch your back, Leif," Thorstein vowed. "Knut and his men will not get the chance to harm you. If they try, we will be there to witness it and to stop them." Leif also spoke quietly with several of the other men he trusted, not revealing the full extent of the plot but asking them to be vigilant during the hunt, to watch for any unusual behavior or suspicious movements. He wanted as many eyes as possible on Knut and his supporters, making it harder for them to act without being observed. Solveig, meanwhile, continued her own preparations. She spoke with Inga and some of the other women, casually mentioning how worried she was about Leif going on the hunt, how she had heard that Knut's men would be participating and feared there might be trouble. She planted seeds of suspicion carefully, ensuring that if something did happen to Leif, there would be voices ready to question the official story. On the morning of the hunt, Solveig helped Leif prepare, checking his weapons and ensuring he had everything he needed. Her hands trembled slightly as she fastened his cloak, and he caught them gently in his own. "I will return to you," he said firmly, tilting her chin up so she had to meet his eyes. "This I swear on my honor and my love for you." "And I will be waiting," Solveig replied, forcing strength into her voice that she did not entirely feel. The hunting party assembled as the sun broke over the eastern mountains, casting long shadows across the settlement. There were perhaps 20 men in total, equipped with bows, spears, and axes for the hunt. The plan was to venture into the forests that stretched inland from Kaupang, where deer and wild boar were plentiful this time of year. The meat they brought back would be salted and smoked, providing essential sustenance through the long winter months ahead. Solveig stood with the other women who had come to see the hunters off, but her eyes never left Leif. He moved among the men with quiet confidence, checking supplies and organizing the group into smaller teams that would spread out through the forest to maximize their chances of success. She noticed that he had positioned Thorstein and his sons close to himself, while Canute and his known supporters were assigned to what appeared to be the farthest positions. Canute noticed this arrangement as well, and Solveig saw displeasure flash across his face before he controlled his expression. He approached Leif with a smile that did not reach his eyes. "Leif," Canute said with false congeniality, "I thought perhaps my men and I could hunt alongside you today. We are experienced trackers, and it would be an honor to learn from Orm's chosen guardian." Leif regarded him coolly, and Solveig held her breath, waiting to see how he would respond to this obvious attempt to get closer to him. "Your offer is generous, Canute," Leif replied evenly, "but I think it better if we spread our skills throughout the hunting party. Your experience will be more valuable leading your own group. I have assigned you the northern section of the forest, where the deer trails are most active this season. Thorstein and I will take the western approach." It was a smooth deflection, and Canute could not object without making his true intentions obvious. His jaw tightened, but he nodded with apparent grace. "As you command," he said, though the words carried an edge of mockery. "May your hunt be successful, Leif Svensson." "And yours as well," Leif responded, his tone giving nothing away. The hunting party set out, disappearing into the tree line as the women returned to their daily tasks. Solveig tried to occupy herself with work, joining the others at the looms, but her mind remained in the forest with Leif. Every sound made her jump. Every shout from the settlement's children made her heart race, fearing it was news of disaster. Inga noticed her distraction and placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "He will be fine," the older woman said kindly. "Leif is a warrior born. He can handle himself in the woods as well as on the battlefield." "I know," Solveig replied, forcing a smile, "but I cannot help but worry. A wife's prerogative, I suppose." "You love him," Inga observed, her eyes knowing. "I can see it in the way you look at him, the way you speak his name. It is good. A marriage built on love is stronger than one built merely on duty or obligation." Solveig felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she did not deny it. "I did not expect to love him," she admitted quietly. "When my father told me I was to marry one of Orm's warriors, I thought my life was ending. But instead, it was beginning. Leif has shown me kindness and respect I did not dare hope for. He has given me a partnership rather than a prison. How could I not love such a man?" "Then trust in that love," Inga advised. "Trust that it will bring him back to you safely." Meanwhile, in the forest, Leif moved through the undergrowth with the practiced silence of a hunter who had learned his craft well. Thorstein walked beside him, his sons Eric and Halvard positioned slightly behind and to the sides, forming a protective formation around Leif without making it obvious to any observers. They had seen signs of deer, tracks in the soft earth, and droppings that indicated a herd had passed through recently. But Leif's mind was only partially on the hunt. His senses were heightened, every sound and movement analyzed for potential threat. He knew that Canute and his men were somewhere in these woods, and that they would be looking for an opportunity to strike. The question was when and how they would make their attempt. Would it be an arrow from hiding, as Solveig had overheard, or would they try something more direct if they found him in a vulnerable position? The morning passed slowly, the hunting party spreading out through the forest in pursuit of game. Leif's group managed to bring down a young stag, a good kill that would provide substantial meat. As they were field dressing the animal, Eric suddenly tensed, his hand moving to the axe at his belt. "Father," he said quietly, his eyes scanning the trees around them. "We are being watched." Leif did not look up from his work, keeping his movements casual and unhurried. "Where?" he asked, his voice low. "North and east," Eric replied. "At least 2 men, perhaps more. They have been following us for the last hour, staying just out of sight, but not covering their tracks well enough." Thorstein grunted. "Canute's men, no doubt. They were supposed to be hunting the northern section. What are they doing in our area?" "Looking for an opportunity," Leif said grimly. He finished securing the deer's carcass so they could carry it and straightened, his hand resting casually on his sword hilt. "Let us give them one, but on our terms. Thorstein, you and Halvard take the deer back toward the rally point. Make it look like you are departing with the kill. Eric, you will circle around and come up behind wherever these watchers are positioned. I will continue deeper into the forest, appearing to be tracking alone. If they make a move, you will be in position to see it and to intervene." "That is risky," Thorstein objected. "You will be exposed, vulnerable." "That is the point," Leif replied. "We need to catch them in the act, with witnesses who can testify to what they saw. Eric, Can you move quietly enough to get into position without being detected? Eric nodded, his young face set with determination. I can. And if they threaten you, I will make them regret it. No killing unless absolutely necessary, Leif instructed firmly. We want them alive to face justice. Dead men cannot confess their crimes or implicate their co-conspirators. The plan was set in motion. Thorstein and Halvard departed with the deer, their voices carrying through the forest as they discussed the best route back to the rally point. Leif watched them go, then turned and headed deeper into the woods, moving as if searching for more game. Behind him, he knew Eric was melting into the shadows, circling around to come up behind their watchers. Leif's every sense was alert as he walked, his ears straining for the whisper of an arrow being knocked, his eyes scanning for movement in his peripheral vision. He made himself appear focused on the ground, on tracking signs, while actually watching for ambush from every direction. The forest was quiet around him, too quiet, and he knew that meant predators were near, though these predators walked on two legs and carried weapons forged by men. Then he heard it, the faint creak of a bowstring being drawn taut. Instinct and years of battlefield experience took over. Leif dove to the side just as an arrow hissed through the space where his head had been a moment before, embedding itself in a tree trunk with a solid thunk. He rolled to his feet, sword already in hand, turning to face the direction from which the arrow had come. Two men emerged from the undergrowth, both armed with bows and wearing the grim expressions of men committed to murder. Leif recognized them as part of Knut's crew, sailors and fighters who had stood with their captain during the confrontation in the Great Hall. They were knocking new arrows, moving to flank him and give themselves clear shots. So it comes to this, Leif said coldly, his sword held ready. Open murder in the forest. Does Knut think this will go unnoticed? Does he believe there will be no consequences? One of the men, a scarred fighter named Ulf, sneered at him. Accidents happen on hunts, Svensson. Everyone knows that. An arrow gone astray, a tragic loss. By the time Orm returns, you will be in the ground and Knut will be the one holding Kaupang together. The settlement will have moved on, and your pretty wife will have found a new husband to warm her bed. The mention of Solveig sent a surge of fury through Leif, but he controlled it, channeling it into cold focus. You will not touch her, he said, his voice deadly quiet, and you will not succeed in this pathetic attempt on my life. Did you really think I did not know you were following me? Did you think I was fool enough to come into these woods without taking precautions? Uncertainty flickered across the men's faces, and they glanced at each other nervously. He is bluffing, the other man, called Orm, said. There is no one else here. It is just him against us. We take him down now, and we can claim we found him dead, killed by bandits or wild animals. They drew their bows again, arrows aimed at Leif's chest. But before they could loose their shots, Eric burst from the trees behind them, his axe already swinging. The flat of the blade caught Ulf across the back, sending him sprawling forward, his arrow flying wild. Orm spun, trying to bring his bow around to face this new threat, but Leif was already moving, closing the distance between them in 3 long strides. Leif's sword swept up, knocking the bow from Orm's hands and sending it clattering into the undergrowth. His other hand shot out and grabbed the man by the throat, lifting him half off his feet. Orm scrabbled at Leif's iron grip, his face reddening as his air was cut off. You made a grave mistake, Leif said, his voice like winter itself. You attempted to murder the man Jarl Orm himself chose to guard his holdings. For that crime the penalty is death. But I am going to give you a choice. You can die here, now quickly and cleanly. Or you can live, return to the settlement, and confess your crime and Knut's role in planning it before all the people of Kaupang. Choose quickly, before I decide for you. Orm's eyes bulged, his hands weakly pulling at Leif's wrist. I confess, he gasped out. Will confess everything. Leif released him, letting him drop to the ground where he lay, gasping and coughing. Eric had Ulf secured as well, the man's hands bound with cord, his face bloodied from where he had hit the ground. Both would-be assassins looked terrified now, the reality of their failure and its consequences sinking in. Eric, well done, Leif said, clasping the young warrior's shoulder. Your timing was perfect. Now, let us return these traitors to the settlement and let them explain themselves to everyone who doubted my warnings about Knut. But as they began to secure the prisoners, a new voice rang out through the forest, filled with desperation and rage. I think not, Svensson. Canute himself emerged from the trees, flanked by 4 more of his men, all armed and ready for violence. The merchant captain's face was twisted with fury and fear, the look of a man who knew his plans had unraveled and was prepared to do anything to salvage them. "You meddling fool," Canute snarled. "Why could you not just die like you were supposed to? Why did you have to make everything so complicated? I could have led Kaupang well. I could have brought prosperity and freedom to the men who are tired of Orm's heavy hand. But no, you had to be the perfect, loyal warrior, enforcing every law, questioning every decision. So you decided to kill me," Leif said flatly, his sword still in hand, his body positioned between the prisoners and Canute's men. "You decided that murder was preferable to accepting the will of Jarl Orm and the judgment of the settlement's men." "It was necessary," Canute shouted, spittle flying from his lips. "You were destroying everything, turning the men into frightened sheep, afraid to take what should rightfully be theirs. I did what I had to do to preserve our way of life." "You mean preserve your ability to steal from Orm and line your own pockets?" Eric interjected, his young voice filled with contempt. "Do not dress up your greed and ambition as noble purpose, Canute. You are a thief and a traitor, and everyone will know it." Canute's face purpled with rage. "Kill them," he commanded his men. "Kill them all. We will say they were attacked by bandits, that we arrived too late to save them. With Leif and these witnesses dead, there is no one to contradict our story." The 4 men advanced, weapons drawn, murder in their eyes. Leif assessed the situation rapidly. He and Eric were outnumbered 3 to 1, with 2 prisoners to protect who could testify to Canute's crimes. The odds were not good, but Leif had faced worse and survived. He shifted his grip on his sword, preparing to sell his life as dearly as possible if it meant keeping Eric and the prisoners alive long enough for help to arrive. But help arrived sooner than expected. The sounds of crashing through the undergrowth heralded the arrival of Thorstein and Halvard, along with 3 other hunters who had heard the commotion and come to investigate. They burst into the clearing, weapons ready, and the situation shifted dramatically. Now Canute and his men were the ones outnumbered, facing a force of 7 armed warriors, several of whom were known for their prowess in battle. Canute looked around desperately, seeing his plans crumbling to dust around him. His men were wavering, their confidence evaporating as they realized they had been caught red-handed in an act of attempted murder. "Lay down your weapons, Canute," Thorstein commanded, his voice carrying the authority of his years and experience. "It is over. You are caught, your plot exposed. Surrender now, and perhaps Orm will show mercy. Continue this madness, and you will die here in this forest, unmourned and dishonored." For a long moment, Canute stood frozen, his mind clearly racing through his rapidly diminishing options. Then, with a roar of frustrated rage, he threw down his axe and fell to his knees. "I yield," he said bitterly. "I yield to Leif Svensson, guardian of Kaupang." His men followed suit, dropping their weapons and kneeling, their faces reflecting their fear of what would come next. Leif approached Canute slowly, his sword still at the ready, until he stood directly before the kneeling man. "You will confess your crimes before the people of Kaupang," Leif said quietly. "You will name everyone who was involved in your plot, and you will accept whatever judgment Jarl Orm decrees when he returns. This is the mercy I offer you, your life, in exchange for the truth. Refuse, and I will execute you here and now for attempting to murder Orm's appointed guardian." Canute looked up at him, hatred burning in his eyes, but also resignation. He knew he had lost, that there was no escape from the consequences of his actions. "I will confess," he said hoarsely. "I will tell you everything." The hunters secured all of Canute's men with ropes and began the journey back to the settlement. The successful hunt was forgotten now, overshadowed by the drama of treachery and justice. As they walked, Leif found himself beside Thorstein, who looked at him with new respect. "You handled that well," the older warrior said. "Better than well, truth be told. You turned Canute's trap against him, gathered the evidence you needed, and did it all without unnecessary bloodshed. Orm chose well when he made you guardian of Kaupang." "I had help," Leif replied, nodding toward Eric. "And I had warning, thanks to my wife's sharp ears and quick thinking. Without Solveig, I might indeed have fallen to Canute's arrow." "A good wife is worth more than gold," Thorstein agreed. "Treasure her life. Such partnerships are rare in this world." "I intend to." Leif said quietly, his thoughts turning to Solveig, waiting back at the settlement. The news of what had happened in the forest spread through Kaupang like wildfire. By the time the hunting party returned, bound prisoners in tow, the entire settlement had gathered near the great hall, their faces a mixture of shock, anger, and vindication. Those who had supported Leif felt their trust confirmed, while those who had harbored doubts about Knut's accusations now saw the merchant captain's true nature revealed in all its ugliness. Solveig stood at the front of the crowd, her heart soaring with relief when she saw Leif walking tall and unharmed. Their eyes met across the distance, and she saw in his gaze both triumph and tenderness. He had survived, just as he had promised. When he reached her, he paused briefly, and though propriety might have dictated otherwise, she threw herself into his arms, not caring who saw or what they might think. "You are safe," she whispered against his chest, feeling his heart beat strong and steady beneath her cheek. "Thank the gods. You are safe." Leif's arms tightened around her for a moment before he gently set her back, mindful of the watching crowd and the prisoners who needed to be dealt with. "Thanks to you," he said quietly, for her ears alone. "Your warning saved my life, Solveig. I will never forget that." The formal proceedings began immediately. Leif ordered the prisoners brought before the assembled people of Kaupang, and he recounted everything that had transpired in the forest. Eric and the other witnesses corroborated his account, describing how Knut's men had attempted to murder Leif with arrows from hiding, how Knut himself had arrived with reinforcements intending to kill everyone who could testify against him. Then Leif called upon Ulf and Orm, the two would-be assassins, to speak. Faced with the choice between a quick death and the possibility of mercy, both men confirmed everything Leif had said. They described how Knut had approached them weeks ago, complaining about Leif's strict enforcement of Orm's laws, how the complaints had gradually evolved into discussions of what might be done to remove the obstacle Leif represented. Knut said it would be simple. Ulf testified, his voice shaking with fear and shame. He said accidents happen on hunts all the time. He said that once Leif was dead, the settlement would return to the old ways, where men had more freedom to conduct their business as they saw fit. He promised us shares in the profits, positions of authority when he took control. The crowd murmured angrily at this, and several people shouted questions or accusations. Leif raised his hand for silence, and remarkably, the crowd obeyed, settling down to hear what else would be revealed. Finally, Leif turned to Knut himself. The merchant captain knelt in the dirt before the great hall, his hands bound behind his back, his face a mask of bitter defeat. "You swore to confess everything," Leif reminded him. "Now is the time. Tell these people the full extent of your crimes, Knut Ironhand. Tell them how you plan to betray not just me, but Jarl Orm himself." Knut was silent for a long moment, his jaw working as if chewing on words too bitter to speak. But under the weight of Leif's steady gaze and the hostile stares of the assembled crowd, his resistance crumbled. "It is all true," he said hoarsely. "Everything Leif has said, everything these men have testified to. I planned to kill him. I planned to take control of Kaupang while Orm was away. And yes, I have been stealing from the Jarl for years, skimming profits from trades and hiding wealth that should have been his." The crowd erupted in outrage, and this time Leif let them vent their anger. People shouted accusations and insults, demanding immediate justice. Some called for Knut to be hanged, others for him to be cast out into the wilderness to die of exposure. Through it all, Knut knelt with his head bowed, accepting the condemnation as his due. When the initial fury had subsided, Leif spoke again, his voice carrying clearly over the noise. "Knut Ironhand and his co-conspirators have confessed to attempted murder and theft from our Jarl. These are serious crimes, worthy of death under our laws. However, I am not Jarl Orm. I do not have the authority to pass final judgment on crimes of this magnitude. Therefore, Knut and his men will be held in secure confinement until the Jarl returns. At that time, they will be brought before him to receive his judgment." This pronouncement seemed to satisfy most of the crowd, though some still grumbled that justice delayed was justice denied. But Thorstein stepped forward and added his voice to Leif's decision. "Leif is right," the old warrior declared. "These crimes are against the Jarl himself. Only Orm can decide the proper punishment. To act otherwise would be to overstep our authority and potentially insult Orm by denying him the right to dispense justice for offenses against his own person and property." The logic was sound. and the remaining dissenters fell silent. Under Leif's direction, the prisoners were taken to a storage house that was quickly converted into a makeshift jail. Guards were posted, men whose loyalty to Leif was unquestioned, and the settlement began to settle back into its routines, though the events of the day would be discussed around hearth fires for many nights to come. That evening, as Solveig and Leif sat together in their home, the tension of the past weeks finally began to drain away. Solveig had prepared a meal of stew and fresh bread, and they ate in comfortable silence for a time, simply enjoying each other's presence and the knowledge that the immediate danger had passed. "What do you think Orm will do when he returns?" Solveig asked eventually, setting aside her bowl. Leif considered the question carefully. Knut's crimes are serious, and the theft alone would normally warrant death. The attempted murder makes it even worse. But Orm is not always predictable. He values loyalty above almost everything else, and Knut's betrayal will anger him deeply. I would not be surprised if he makes an example of them, to ensure that no one else considers challenging his authority. "Does that trouble you?" Solveig asked, studying his face. "Death never troubles me as much as it perhaps should," Leif admitted. "I have seen too much of it, dealt it too often myself. But yes, there is a part of me that wishes there could be another way, that men like Knut could be redeemed rather than destroyed. Unfortunately, the world we live in does not often allow for such mercies." Solveig moved closer to him, taking his hand in hers. "You are a good man, Leif Svensson," she said softly. "A better man than you give yourself credit for. You could have killed Knut and his men in the forest. Many warriors would have, claiming justice or self-defense. But you chose to bring them back alive, to give them the chance to confess and face proper judgment. That speaks to your character, to the honor you carry, even when you doubt yourself." Leif raised her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles. "You make me want to be better than I am," he said quietly. "Before you, I was content to be merely a weapon, a tool to be used by those with the authority to command me. But you see me as more than that. You see the man I could be, the man I want to be. That is a precious gift, Solveig." "Then let us both strive to be better," Solveig suggested. "Together, we can build the life we spoke of, the peaceful life where our greatest concerns are the harvest and the weather, not plots and betrayals." They spent the rest of the evening talking about that future, making plans for when Orm returned and the current crisis was resolved. Leif spoke of perhaps asking the Jarl for a plot of land where they could build a farmstead of their own, a place where they could raise crops and animals, and eventually children. Solveig shared her own dreams of a home filled with warmth and laughter, of teaching their children to read the runes and navigate by the stars as her father had taught her. The weeks that followed were peaceful, almost idyllic compared to the tension that had come before. With Knut and his conspirators securely imprisoned, Leif's authority in Kaupang was unquestioned. The settlement's defenses were maintained, disputes were settled fairly, and the preparations for winter proceeded smoothly. The other men who had initially been skeptical of Leif's leadership now showed him genuine respect, and some even sought his counsel on matters beyond simple governance. Solveig, too, found her place in the settlement's social fabric. The women who had been reserved or suspicious now welcomed her openly, impressed by her quick thinking in warning Leif about the plot, and by her grace in her new role as the Guardian's wife. She formed real friendships, particularly with Inga and Thorstein's wife, Astrid, and together they worked to ensure that the settlement's households were prepared for the coming winter. One crisp afternoon, about a month after the incident in the forest, Solveig was working at the loom in their home, when she heard the distinctive call of the watchman from the settlement's high point. "Ship's approaching! Jarl Orm returns!" Her heart leaped with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. Orm's return meant that the crisis would finally be resolved, but it also meant that Leif's temporary authority would end, and their future would once again be in the hands of the Jarl. She set aside her weaving and went to find Leif, discovering him already organizing men to receive the returning raiders. The longships came into view slowly, their dragon prows cutting through the water with the same majesty they had displayed when they departed. But Solveig noticed immediately that there were fewer ships returning than had left. Of the 5 vessels that had sailed away, only 4 were coming back. She saw Leif notice the same thing, his jaw tightening with concern. When the ships docked and the warriors disembarked, it became clear that the raids had been costly. Many men bore fresh wounds, and their faces were grim rather than jubilant. The plunder they carried was substantial, chests of silver and bundles of fine cloth, but the price paid in blood had clearly been high. Jarl Orm himself looked older than he had when he departed, his red beard now streaked with more gray, a fresh scar cutting across his left cheek. But his eyes were as sharp as ever, and they found Leif immediately in the crowd gathered to welcome the raiders home. "Leif Svensson," Orm called out, his voice still strong despite his evident weariness. "I trust my settlement is as I left it?" "It is, Jarl Orm," Leif replied, stepping forward and bowing his head in respect. "Kaupang is secure and prosperous, but there are matters we must discuss, serious matters that require your judgment." Orm's eyebrows rose with interest. "Indeed? Well, such discussions can wait until I have had a chance to wash the salt from my skin and drink something stronger than seawater. Tonight, we feast to celebrate our return. Tomorrow you will tell me of these matters that require my attention." The feast that night was bittersweet. There was celebration for the warriors who had returned and mourning for those who had not. Orm told stories of the raids, of battles fought along the coasts of distant lands, of treasures won and enemies vanquished. But underlying the bravado was a weariness, a sense that the glory of raiding was perhaps not as bright as it had once seemed. Solveig sat beside Leif at the high table, and she noticed how Orm's eyes occasionally drifted to them, studying their interaction with evident interest. At one point the Jarl leaned over and spoke to Leif in a voice loud enough for those nearby to hear. "Your wife suits you well, Leif," Orm observed. "I had wondered if the arrangement would prove satisfactory, but I see that you have made the best of it. She carries herself with dignity, and the women tell me she has proven herself capable and wise. You have done well." "Thank you, Jarl," Leif replied. "Solveig has been a blessing beyond what I deserved. I am grateful for the marriage you arranged, though I confess I did not feel gratitude at the time." Orm laughed, a booming sound that drew attention from across the hall. "Few men are grateful for their marriages at first, but a wise man learns to appreciate a good wife, and I think you are learning that lesson well." The next morning Leif met with Orm in the Jarl's private chambers and recounted everything that had transpired during his absence. He told of Knut's growing discontent, the confrontation in the hall, the overheard plot, and the attempted murder in the forest. He presented the prisoners and had them repeat their confessions before the Jarl. Orm listened to it all in silence, his face growing darker with each revelation. When the tale was complete, Orm sat back in his chair and regarded Leif with a mixture of approval and anger. "You handled this well, Leif," he said finally. "Better than I might have expected. You gathered evidence, acted with restraint when you could have simply killed them all, and ensured that justice would be seen to be done rather than appearing as vengeance or tyranny. This is the mark of a true leader, not just a warrior." "Thank you, Jarl," Leif said, bowing his head. "As for Knut and his men," Orm continued, his voice hardening, "their crimes are inexcusable. Theft from me I might have punished with fines or forced labor, depending on the amount and the circumstances, but attempting to murder my chosen guardian, plotting to seize control of Kaupang in my absence, these are betrayals that cannot be forgiven or forgotten." He stood and walked to the window, looking out over the settlement he ruled. "At dawn tomorrow, Knut Ironhand and the 2 men who fired arrows at you will be hanged. Their deaths will serve as a reminder to all that betrayal carries the highest price. The others who were part of the plot but did not directly attempt murder will be outlawed, stripped of their property and exiled from my lands. They will have 3 days to gather what they can carry and leave, never to return on pain of death." Leif nodded, having expected something like this. "It is just, Jarl Orm." "There is one more matter," Orm said, turning back to face Leif. "I have been thinking during the voyage home about the future of Kaupang and my own role in it." Leif waited, sensing that whatever Orm was about to say would be significant. The Jarl paced slowly across the room, his hands clasped behind his back, clearly organizing his thoughts before speaking. "I am getting old, Leif," Orm said finally, a note of weariness in his voice that Solveig had never heard before. "This last raid proved it to me beyond any doubt. I lost good men who trusted me to lead them to glory and riches. Some of those deaths were due to my own mistakes, to judgment clouded by age and overconfidence. I can no longer pretend that I am the warrior I once was." "Jarl Orm, you are still strong," Leif began, but Orm raised a hand to stop him. "Do not placate me with false comfort, Leif. We both know the truth. My reflexes are slower, my strength diminished. Another 5 years, perhaps 10 if the gods are generous, and I will be too old to lead raids at all. But Kaupang still needs leadership, still needs someone who can protect it and guide it through the challenges that will come. He paused, studying Leif intently. The way you handled Knut's betrayal, the respect you earned from the men, the wisdom you showed in balancing justice with mercy, all of this tells me that you could be that leader. Leif felt his breath catch. What are you saying, Jarl? I am saying that I want you to remain as the primary guardian of Kaupang, Orm declared. Not temporarily while I am away, but permanently. I will still hold the title of Jarl, will still lead raids when I am able, but the day-to-day governance of the settlement, the responsibility for its defense and prosperity, that will fall to you. You will act with my full authority, and your decisions will carry the weight of my own. The offer was staggering, far beyond anything Leif had imagined. To be given such power, such responsibility, was both an honor and a burden. He thought of all the reasons he might refuse, all the ways this could go wrong. But then he thought of Solveig, of the life they were building together, of the settlement they had both grown to care for deeply. I accept Jarl Orm, Leif said, his voice steady, despite the turmoil of emotions within him. I will serve Kaupang and its people with all the strength and wisdom I possess. This I swear. Orm smiled, genuine warmth breaking through his usual gruff demeanor. Good. I had hoped you would say that. There is one condition, however. The land to the east of the settlement, where the river meets the forest, I am granting that to you as your personal holding. You will build your home there, establish your farmstead, and from that position, you will watch over Kaupang. It is fertile land, Leif, good for crops and livestock. You and your wife can make a life there, raise your family, and still fulfill your duties to the settlement. It was more than Leif had dared dream. The land Orm described was some of the best in the area, and the prospect of having a true home of his own, a place where he and Solveig could build their future, filled him with a joy he had not felt since before his family was destroyed all those years ago. I do not know what to say, Leif admitted. Your generosity overwhelms me, Jarl. Say nothing, Orm replied. Just continue to serve with the honor and dedication you have shown. That is payment enough for me. Now go, tell your wife the good news. I imagine she will be pleased to learn that you are not just a warrior anymore, but a man of property and position. Leif found Solveig in their home, mending one of his tunics by the light of the afternoon sun streaming through the window. She looked up as he entered, and whatever she saw in his face made her set aside her sewing and rise to meet him. What happened? She asked, searching his expression. Did Orm pass judgment on Knut? He did, Leif confirmed. Knut and the two who fired at me will hang at dawn. The others will be exiled. But that is not why I look as I do. He took both her hands in his, holding them gently. Orm has made me the permanent guardian of Kaupang. More than that, he has granted us land to the east, where we can build our own home, our own life. Everything we talked about, Solveig, everything we dreamed of, it is within our grasp now. Tears sprang to Solveig's eyes, but they were tears of joy. She threw her arms around his neck, laughing and crying at the same time. Oh, Leif, this is wonderful. Better than I could have hoped for. We can truly build the life we want now. The peaceful life with children and crops and all the simple joys we spoke of. Leif held her close, breathing in the scent of her hair, feeling the warmth of her body against his. We can, he agreed, and we will. Starting tomorrow, after the executions are carried out and justice is served, we will begin building our future. That night, as they lay together in their bed for what would be one of the last times in this small house, they talked long into the darkness about their plans. They would build a proper farmstead with a main hall large enough for a growing family, outbuildings for animals and storage, and fields for crops. They would plant barley and oats, raise sheep and cattle, and create something lasting and good. I want our children to grow up knowing safety and love, Solveig said softly, her head resting on Leif's chest. I want them to have the childhood you and I both lost in different ways. No fear, no violence, no uncertainty about tomorrow. They will, Leif promised. I will make sure of it. Everything I do from this day forward will be to ensure that our children and our children's children have better lives than we did. That is my oath to you, Solveig, and to the family we will create together. The dawn came too quickly, bringing with it the grim duty of executing the conspirators. The entire settlement gathered to witness justice being carried out. Canute and his 2 accomplices were led to the gallows that had been erected in the night, their faces pale but resigned. Canute looked across the crowd and found Leif standing beside Orm, and for a moment their eyes met. "I regret that it came to this, Canute," Leif said, his voice carrying in the morning stillness. "You had talent and intelligence that could have been used for good. Instead, you chose betrayal and violence. May the gods judge you more kindly than we did." Canute said nothing, but he nodded once, a gesture that might have been acknowledgement or simply acceptance of his fate. The executions were carried out swiftly and efficiently, and when it was done, the bodies were taken down and prepared for burial in the places reserved for criminals and outlaws, far from the honored dead. The exiles departed later that same day, their few possessions loaded onto a small boat. They were given supplies enough to reach the next settlement, but nothing more. As they pushed away from the dock, several looked back at Kaupang with expressions of loss and regret. They had gambled on Canute's ambition and lost everything. With the crisis finally resolved and justice served, life in Kaupang began to return to its normal rhythms, though the settlement was forever changed by what had occurred. The people had seen what happened to those who betrayed their jarl and their community, and they had also seen Leif's leadership and integrity proven beyond any doubt. Over the following weeks, work began on Leif and Solveig's farmstead. The settlement's men volunteered their labor, grateful to the guardian who had protected them and eager to help him establish his new home. The sound of axes biting into wood and hammers driving pegs echoed across the land as the main hall began to take shape. It would be a beautiful building when complete, with carved pillars and a high roof, worthy of a man of Leif's new status. Solveig threw herself into the work as well, planning the layout of the buildings, deciding where the garden would go, where the animals would be kept. She worked alongside the other women, weaving cloth for their new home, preparing supplies, and learning all she could about farming and animal husbandry. Inga became her teacher and friend, sharing the wisdom of years spent managing a successful farmstead. As autumn deepened and the first snows began to dust the mountains in the distance, Solveig discovered something that filled her with both joy and trepidation. She had missed her monthly courses twice now, and her body was changing in ways she recognized from stories the older women had shared. She was carrying Leif's child. She chose to tell him one evening as they sat by the fire in their temporary home, the one they would soon leave for the farmstead that was nearly complete. She had prepared his favorite meal and waited until they had eaten before taking his hand and placing it gently on her still flat belly. "Leif," she said softly, watching his face, "we are going to have a child. You are going to be a father." The expression that crossed his features was one of pure wonder. His gray eyes, usually so controlled and guarded, filled with tears that he made no attempt to hide. "Solveig," he whispered, his voice breaking with emotion. "Are you certain?" "As certain as I can be," she replied, smiling through her own tears. "By summer, if the gods are willing, you will hold your son or daughter in your arms." Leif pulled her into his embrace, holding her with infinite gentleness, as if she were the most precious thing in all the world. "I never thought I would have this," he said, his voice muffled against her hair. "A family of my own, a child to love and protect. After Sigrid died, I believed that part of life was closed to me forever. But you have given me everything, Solveig. Hope, love, purpose, and now this greatest gift of all. We have given each other these things," Solveig corrected gently. "We have built this life together, step by step, from the moment my father handed me to you on that pier. You protected me with your life, Leif, just as the title of our story says, but I protected you too, in my own way. We protected each other, and now we will protect this child, and any others the gods bless us with." The winter passed peacefully. The farmstead was completed, and Leif and Solveig moved into their new home just as the first serious snows arrived. It was everything they had dreamed of, warm and solid, and theirs. Leif continued his duties as guardian of Kaupang, but now he had a true home to return to each evening, a wife who loved him, and the promise of a child to come. Solveig's pregnancy progressed smoothly, her body growing round with new life. The women of the settlement rallied around her, offering advice and support, sharing their own experiences and wisdom. Leif was attentive and protective, sometimes overly so, until Solveig had to remind him that women had been bearing children since the beginning of time and she was strong enough to handle it. Jarl Orm visited their farmstead often, clearly pleased with how things had turned out. He and Leif would sit by the fire and discuss matters of governance and defense, but increasingly, Orm seemed content to let Leif make the decisions, trusting in the judgment of the man he had chosen to succeed him in all but name. Spring came with a rush of melting snow and budding flowers. The fields were plowed and planted, animals were brought to the farmstead, and life bloomed all around them. Solveig's time drew near, and one warm evening in late spring, as the sun painted the sky in shades of gold and rose, her labor began. It was a long night, filled with pain and struggle, but also with the steady presence of Leif holding her hand, wiping her brow, whispering words of encouragement and love. The midwives worked with practiced efficiency, and when dawn broke over the eastern mountains, a new voice joined the chorus of sounds in the farmstead, the strong, healthy cry of a newborn child. "A daughter," the midwife announced, placing the squirming, red-faced infant in Solveig's exhausted arms. A beautiful, perfect daughter. Solveig looked down at the tiny face, at the wisps of honey-colored hair, and the eyes that would probably be gray like her father's, and felt her heart overflow with love so intense it was almost painful. "Hello, little one," she whispered. "Welcome to the world." Leif knelt beside the bed, his large hand gently touching the baby's tiny fist. When the infant's fingers wrapped around his thumb with surprising strength, he let out a choked laugh that was half sob. "She is perfect," he said, wonder filling his voice. "Absolutely perfect. What shall we name her?" Solveig had been thinking about this for months, and now the answer came easily. "Sigrid," she said, looking up at Leif with gentle understanding. "We will name her Sigrid, after your sister, so that her name and her memory live on in our daughter, and so that this Sigrid will have all the love and protection and happiness that the first Sigrid deserved but was denied." Leif's tears flowed freely now, and he leaned down to kiss first his daughter's forehead and then his wife's lips. "Thank you," he whispered, "for everything, for seeing me, for loving me, for giving me this family and this life. I was a man with nothing, and you have made me the richest man in the north." "And you," Solveig replied, her own tears mixing with his, "took a woman who was being given away like property, and showed her that she had value, that she mattered, that she could be loved for who she truly was. We saved each other, Leif. That is what makes our story special." In the days and weeks that followed, life settled into new patterns around the presence of little Sigrid. The baby thrived, growing stronger each day, her cries filling the farmstead with life and purpose. Visitors came from the settlement bearing gifts and congratulations, and even Jarl Orm made the journey to meet the newest member of Kaupang's community. The old Jarl held the baby with surprising gentleness, a soft smile on his weathered face. "She will be strong, this one," he pronounced. "I can see it already. She has her mother's beauty and her father's spirit. Raise her well, Leif and Solveig. Teach her the old ways but also the new wisdom. The world is changing, and the next generation will need both strength and adaptability to thrive in it." As summer deepened, bringing long days of golden light and warm breezes, Solveig would often sit outside their home with Sigrid in her arms, watching as Leif worked in the fields or trained the young men of the settlement in combat skills. Sometimes her father Harold would visit, his face glowing with pride and joy at seeing his daughter so happy and his granddaughter so healthy. The debt that had once hung over him like a death sentence had been forgiven by Orm as a wedding gift to Leif, and Harold had used his freedom to rebuild his trading business with careful, honest dealings. "I worried so much when I had to give you to Leif," Harold confided to Solveig one afternoon as they watched the baby sleep. "I thought I was condemning you to a life of misery, and the guilt nearly destroyed me. But the gods were kinder than I deserved. They gave you a man who saw your worth and cherished it. You did what you had to do to survive, father," Solveig said, echoing the words she had spoken to him so long ago on the pier. "And in doing so, you gave me the greatest gift, even if neither of us knew it at the time. I have found love, purpose, and happiness beyond anything I could have imagined. I hold no anger toward you, only gratitude that you made the hard choice that led me to this life." One evening in late summer, as the sun set in a blaze of orange and purple, Leif and Solveig stood together on the small rise behind their farmstead, looking out over the land they had built together. Sigrid slept peacefully in her mother's arms, wrapped in soft wool against the cooling air. In the distance, they could see the smoke rising from Kaupang's hearth fires, could hear the faint sounds of life continuing in the settlement Leif protected and served. "Do you ever regret it?" Solveig asked quietly, The warrior's life you left behind, the raids and battles and the simplicity of living by the sword. Leif was silent for a moment, considering the question seriously. Sometimes I miss the clarity of it, he admitted. The straightforwardness of knowing exactly what was expected, of having a single purpose. But those moments pass quickly when I remember what I have gained in exchange. This life, this family, this peace, it is worth more than all the glory and plunder I could ever have won in 1,000 raids. He turned to look at his wife and daughter, his gray eyes soft with love. My father once told me, before he died, that a man's true wealth is measured not in silver or reputation, but in the people who mourn him when he is gone and remember him with love. I did not understand what he meant then. I was too young, too focused on dreams of becoming a great warrior. But I understand now. This, what we have built together, this is the legacy I want to leave. Not tales of battles won or enemies slain, but children and grandchildren who know they are loved, who have never known the kind of loss and pain that shaped my early life. Solveig leaned against him, feeling the solid strength of his body supporting hers, the steady beat of his heart. Then that is the legacy we will build, she said firmly, together. For as long as the gods grant us life and breath, we will nurture this family and this land. We will teach our children about honor and love, about the importance of both strength and compassion. And when our time comes to join the ancestors, we will leave behind something good and true that will endure long after we are gone. As if in agreement, baby Sigrid stirred and made a small sound, her tiny hand reaching up toward her father's face. Leif caught it gently, marveling again at the perfection of those miniature fingers, at the trust evident in his daughter's peaceful sleep. This was what he had fought for, what he had survived for, even when he did not know it. This moment, this family, this life. The stars began to appear in the darkening sky, the same stars that had guided sailors and warriors and lovers since time immemorial. Leif remembered teaching Solveig to navigate by those stars during their courtship, remembered her quick mind grasping the patterns and meanings. One day they would teach Sigrid the same skills, would pass on the knowledge that connected generations and bound families together across the years. "Come," Solveig said softly, touching Leif's arm. "It grows late, and our daughter needs to be put to bed properly. Tomorrow will bring new challenges and new joys, but tonight, let us simply be grateful for what we have." They walked together back to their home, the farmstead that stood as a testament to their journey from strangers bound by obligation to partners united by love. Inside, the fire burned warm and bright, casting dancing shadows on the walls decorated with the beginnings of the life they were building. There would be more children, the gods willing. There would be seasons of plenty and seasons of hardship. There would be joys and sorrows, triumphs and challenges. But through it all, they would face the future together, just as they had faced everything else since that autumn day when Harald Magnusson had handed his daughter to a Viking warrior on a windswept pier, never knowing that he was not condemning her to a life of misery, but giving her the chance to find a love that would transform them both. Leif had protected Solveig with his life, as the old story said. But she had protected him as well, had saved him from a life of emptiness and given him purpose beyond the sword. Together they had built something rare and precious, a love that began in duty but flowered into devotion, a partnership that strengthened them both, and a family that would carry their legacy forward into the future. As they settled in for the night, with Sigrid sleeping peacefully in her cradle and the fire burning low, Solveig and Leif held each other close, grateful beyond words for the journey that had brought them to this moment, and ready to face whatever tomorrow might bring, together, always together.